1942 was the year production commenced on the Dodge WC62, a rugged 6x6 tactical vehicle that stands as a testament to wartime engineering. Why would the United States military move away from the proven 4x4 configurations of the early 1940s? At first glance, the existing fleet seems sufficient for the demands of the front lines, but in reality, the escalating weight of specialized equipment and the increasing size of infantry squads required a platform with significantly higher load capacity and superior stability on soft ground. This technical necessity birthed the machine capable of transporting 1.5 tons of cargo across the most unforgiving landscapes of Europe and the Pacific. The process of discovery often begins in the most remote geographical regions, where a rusted metallic silhouette breaks the natural horizon. It is visible how the oxidation layer covers the heavy steel frame, yet the distinct silhouette of a specialized military transport remains unmistakable. These vehicles appear as mechanical anomalies, weathered by 8 decades of exposure to the elements, and surrounded by technical questions regarding their original theater of operation. Logistics functioned as the silent backbone of the global conflict, operating with a mechanical importance equal to that of direct firepower. It gets more complex further on. The Dodge WC62 was specifically engineered to address the limitations of lighter trucks by extending the chassis and adding a third powered axle. One can notice how the elongated cargo bed provides the necessary surface area for seating 12 fully equipped soldiers or mounting heavy anti-tank weaponry. This design evolution was not merely an aesthetic change, but a calculated response to the logistical friction encountered during the early campaigns of the war. Because standardized solutions often failed in the deep mud of the Ardennes or the volcanic sands of Pacific Islands, engineers turned to off-standard builds and experimental configurations. The equipment gradually evolved into rare shapes that only dedicated specialists can accurately identify today. Everything only gets more complicated as researchers peel back layers of paint to find original unit markings that reveal the truck's journey from a Detroit assembly line to a forgotten field. The vehicle utilized a reliable 6-cylinder inline engine to provide the torque necessary for its 6-wheel drive system. One can notice how the massive tires, often preserved in dry climates, still grip the earth despite the passage of more than 80 years. These trucks represent the final evolution of the light transport series before the shift toward even heavier post-war platforms. The transition to the next level of heavy logistics was paved by the performance of these specific 6x6 variants. The camera glides along the heavy leaf spring suspension designed to absorb the shock of high-speed transit over broken terrain. It only looks obvious that a truck should have such durability, but in reality, the metallurgical composition of these frames was a closely guarded industrial secret during the mid-40s. Each bolt and weld was a component in a massive supply chain that stretched across entire oceans. Thus, the steel remains as a silent record of a period when industrial output determined the fate of continents. The metal sits in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the moment when a collector or historian initiates the restoration process. The story of these mechanical relics concludes this phase, transitioning into the archival records of military history. 92 horsepower is the output generated by the inline 6-cylinder engine that powered this machine through the Pacific theater. Why was such a relatively low power figure acceptable for a heavy transport vehicle? While the 3.8-liter displacement, equivalent to 230 cubic inches, might seem modest, the torque was engineered specifically for low-end performance. This mechanical calibration allowed the vehicle to conquer steep mountain climbs and navigate thick, muddy terrain where high-speed engines would typically fail. It seems simple at first glance, but the powertrain was a masterpiece of utilitarian ruggedness. A 4-speed manual transmission worked in tandem with a low-range gear set to distribute torque across all 3 axles. This 6x6 drivetrain transformed the vehicle into a highly capable off-road platform. It gets more complex further on. One can notice how the suspension utilizes heavy-duty leaf springs on every axle, providing a rigid and dependable foundation that favored durability over passenger comfort. Flat body panels and tall, flared fenders define the aesthetic of this era of industrial warfare. Deep treaded tires grip the earth, while a canvas-covered open rear section provides a versatile space for logistics. The vehicle was capable of transporting 12 fully equipped soldiers or moving 1.5 tons of cargo through active combat zones. It is visible how the design prioritizes rapid manufacturing and field repairability above all else. Operations during the Normandy landings, the North African campaign, and the Italian front solidified its status status as one of the most versatile assets in the Allied inventory. A nearly identical variant, known as the WC63, featured a front-mounted winch for light recovery and emergency field rescues. The process of deployment was relentless. And this is not the limit. These machines were often pushed to their absolute physical breaking points during the liberation of Europe. Decades after the cessation of hostilities, a single unit was discovered in rural Belgium. It was found tucked away within the confines of an old farm shed, completely overgrown with creeping vines and obscured by rusted farming tools. Only looks obvious as a piece of scrap to the untrained eye. In reality, the landowner had integrated the truck's frame into the structure of a makeshift greenhouse, entirely unaware of the historical value of the machine in his backyard. The equipment gradually transitioned from a weapon of war into a stationary farm implement over the course of 70 years. This fusion of mechanical simplicity and wartime legacy elevates the vehicle beyond the status of a mere transport truck. It serves as a literal time capsule on wheels, preserved by chance in the Belgian countryside. Transition to the next level. The following vehicle traveled across half the globe to reach a destination even more remote and unexpected. 94 horsepower is the output generated by the Hercules JXD inline 6-cylinder engine that powered the Studebaker US6. Produced between 1941 and 1945 in the United States, this vehicle became a cornerstone of wartime logistics. Why was a truck manufactured in America destined to become a legend thousands of miles away in Eurasia? Although its origins were domestic, the US6 was engineered specifically for the Lend-Lease program to supply Allied nations with critical resources. It was the Soviet Union that became the primary recipient of this mechanical endurance. The engine displacement measured 5.7 liters, providing a torque output that remained smooth even during prolonged operations. It gets more complex further on. Power was managed through a 5-speed manual transmission equipped with low-range gearing to navigate deep mud and snow. One can notice how the 6x6 drivetrain, which came standard on units destined for the harshest climates, allowed the wheels to maintain traction on unstable soil. At first glance, the construction seems simple, but in reality, every component was built for extreme durability and rapid field maintenance. The suspension utilized tough semi-elliptical leaf springs to absorb the shocks of uneven terrain. The truck spanned a length of over 20 feet, featuring a reinforced steel cab and a heavy-duty frame designed to resist twisting under load. A wooden cargo bed with removable side panels allowed for rapid reconfiguration depending on the mission requirements. The equipment gradually moved everything from troops and ammunition to fuel, food, and even disassembled artillery pieces. This was particularly vital on front lines where paved infrastructure was entirely non-existent. Over 150,000 units were delivered to the Soviet military, where the vehicle earned the affectionate nickname Studer. After the conflict concluded, the surviving fleet did not vanish but was absorbed into civilian service for reconstruction. Because of this long-term integration into the local economy, decades later, a single unit was rediscovered in a rural barn near Irkutsk, Siberia. The vehicle lay buried under heavy planks and layers of old equipment for years. It is visible how the truck had been repurposed as a stationary storage unit, hidden until a group of local collectors cleared the surrounding debris. One can notice hand-carved Cyrillic markings still etched into the dashboard surface. These were likely left by a Red Army driver who spent months behind the wheel during the height of the war. Everything only gets more complicated. The discovery of such a preserved specimen in the Siberian interior highlights the incredible reach of these machines. This specific phase of the search ends here, as the focus shifts toward an even larger machine abandoned in a dense forest where time stopped. A massive truck remains stationary among the trees, its transition to the next level of decay nearly complete. The metal rests in an even layer of rust and moss, marking the end of its operational life. The journey of the Studebaker concludes with its recovery, leaving the path open for the investigation of the next heavy-duty relic. 7.5 tons is the official load rating for the massive 6x6 heavy-duty artillery prime mover known as the Mack NO. Why did the United States military commission such a specialized machine during the height of global conflict? At first glance, the vehicle might seem over-engineered for simple transport, but in reality, standard trucks lack the structural integrity to move the heaviest ballistic weaponry across broken terrain. This mechanical beast was specifically developed by Mack Trucks between the years 1940 and 1945 to serve as the primary muscle for towing 155mm howitzers and long-range field guns. Brute strength and battlefield resilience defined its design rather than operational speed. Beneath the expansive steel hood sits a Mack EY inline 6-cylinder engine with a massive displacement of 707 cubic inches, which is equivalent to approximately 11.6 liters. One can notice how the sheer scale of the iron block dictates the elongated shape of the front chassis. This power plant produced roughly 170 horsepower, featuring a torque curve engineered exclusively for the movement of extreme weight. The process is only gaining momentum as the mechanical energy transitions through the drivetrain. A 5-speed manual transmission works in tandem with a heavy-duty low-range transfer case to provide raw pulling power across any geographic surface. The truck utilizes a 6x6 drivetrain and a reinforced leaf spring suspension system that maintains chassis stability even when the rear hitch is subjected to the downward force of a massive field piece. Visually, the machine presents a formidable profile characterized by an exceptionally tall hood, oversized fenders, and a steel cab that carries an armored appearance. Massive military-grade tires provide the necessary ground clearance for deep mud and rocky soil. At idle, the internal combustion process generates a deep, growling rumble that signals the immense mechanical potential stored within the cylinders. Heavy use across Western Europe defined its wartime service, though the vehicle also operated extensively within the Pacific theater of operations. In these environments, it was tasked with the constant relocation of critical weapons and heavy support equipment. This legacy of durability ensured that the trucks remained active at various military installations well into the 1950s. But this is just the beginning of the vehicle's long-term endurance. One remarkable example of this engineering was discovered decades later in the dense forests of southern Romania. The location was so remote that a team of enthusiasts had to meticulously trace old wartime transport routes to pinpoint the coordinates. Because the truck was partially buried in the forest floor, only the upper portion of the cab remained visible above the silt and organic debris. It is visible how the environment attempted to reclaim the steel, yet the structure remained largely intact despite the passage of time. Everything only gets more complicated when observing the surrounding vegetation. A tree had taken root directly beside the chassis, and as it matured over 50 years, the trunk physically bent one of the heavy steel doors. This serves as undeniable physical proof that the vehicle had remained completely untouched since the mid-20th century. Upon clearing the debris from the interior, the researchers found original Mack branding and a speedometer still calibrated in miles per hour. Hand tools were found scattered across the floorboards, confirming the identity and the suddenness of the vehicle's original abandonment. The heavy-duty relic survived as a mechanical fragment frozen in time. Transition to the next level of engineering evolution occurs with a European-built machine. This subsequent vehicle was so technologically advanced for its era that it remained in active production for more than 2 decades following the conclusion of the war. This machine represents the next phase of heavy transport development. 6 wheels and a full 6x6 all-wheel drive system define the foundation of the Tatra 111. Why did the German command commission such an ambitious engineering project in occupied Czechoslovakia during 1942? Logistics across extreme terrains required a machine that exceeded the capabilities of standard transport. The manufacturer, already recognized for innovative structural solutions, developed a heavy-duty platform with features so advanced they remained in production for over 2 decades after the conflict ended. One can notice how the design served countries throughout the Soviet bloc until the 1960s. The heart of the vehicle is an air-cooled 12-cylinder V-type diesel engine with 14.8 liters of displacement. It generates approximately 210 horsepower. At first glance, air cooling in a truck of this massive size seems rare for the era, but in reality, it provided a critical advantage. This mechanical choice made the machine far more reliable in the lethal cold of mountain ranges and frozen plains where liquid radiators would fail. But this is just the beginning. The transmission system consists of a 5-speed manual gearbox paired with a specialized low-range transfer case. Independent swing axle suspension, a signature innovation of the Tatra brand, allows the wheels to move vertically while maintaining constant contact with uneven ground. It is visible how the chassis remains stable while the axles articulate over obstacles. This configuration ensures exceptional off-road performance without the need for any additional field modifications. The process is only gaining momentum. Shallow rivers, deep mud, and thick snow are crossed with the same mechanical ease as a paved road. Visually, the machine presents a striking silhouette dominated by a low, long hood. This contrasts sharply with a narrow, angular cabin designed specifically for rapid industrial production and maximum structural protection. Measuring over 26 feet in length and weighing more than 13 tons, the vehicle possesses a physical presence that cannot be ignored. The equipment gradually moves through the landscape with rhythmic precision. The 12-cylinder diesel engine emits a distinct industrial hum that resembles a stationary power plant more than a standard transport truck. During the war years, it operated primarily on cold and mountainous fronts to deliver fuel, ammunition, and heavy mechanical components. In specific tactical scenarios, it even transported light tanks across difficult sectors. It gets more complex further on. After the war, the vehicle transitioned into a standard utility role across the entirety of Eastern Europe. Mining, construction, and forestry sectors utilized the platform for decades due to its immense durability. One of these remarkable machines was discovered 40 years later in an abandoned sawmill located in Slovakia. It lay buried under layers of cut timber and rusted manual tools. The truck had last seen active service in the 1970s, functioning as a makeshift stationary generator for a mechanical hoist system. Everything only gets more complicated when inspecting the mechanical state of the find. The engine still turned over manually, and the clutch remained stuck in a neutral position despite decades of neglect. A local engineer who performed the inspection claimed the vehicle could likely be restored to working order with only minimal technical intervention. This resilience is a testament to the metallurgical standards of the original mid-century production. The equipment remains a silent monument to the engineering logic of its era. Thus, the history of this heavy transport concludes its journey from the front lines to the quiet forests. 102 horsepower represents the total power output of the Gardner 6LW engine driving this massive machine. Why would such a modest numerical value be sufficient for a heavy military transport? The secret lies not in speed, but in the massive torque generated by the 8.3-liter inline 6-cylinder diesel power plant at extremely low revolutions per minute. This specific mechanical configuration allows for the brute force required to move heavy artillery through thick mud, where high-speed engines would simply stall. 6 forward speeds are managed through a manual transmission, where the first and second gears are engineered to be exceptionally short. This allows the vehicle to perform hill starts while under a full load without straining the drivetrain. At first glance, the Scammell Pioneer R100 appears as a mechanical contradiction from the late 1930s. It is a large, slow, and visually awkward construct on paved roads, yet it remains absolutely essential once the pavement ends and the terrain becomes unpredictable. The British manufacturer Scammell broke away from all conventional design standards of the era to create this 6x4 military variant. One can notice how the tall stance and upright front section create a theatrical silhouette that was easily recognizable across the battlefields of World War II. Although only the 2 rear axles receive power, the combination of wide-diameter tires and reinforced semi-elliptic leaf spring suspension provides the traction necessary for recovery missions. The camera glides along the open chassis toward the massive rear bed, which is equipped with specialized metal rails and structural supports for hauling oversized equipment. The equipment gradually moves into position just behind the front lines of combat. From the deserts of North Africa to the dense forests of Western Europe, the R100 performed the critical tasks of recovering damaged tanks and towing heavy howitzers. It does not end at this stage of its operational history. Decades after the conclusion of the war, a single unit was discovered inside a stone barn in a rural area of Scotland. It only looks obvious as a piece of farm equipment after 40 years of serving as a support frame for animal feed and stacks of wood. The truck sat leaning against a stone wall, obscured by layers of heavy tarps and rusted lengths of chain. It remained forgotten by the modern world until a local enthusiast identified the unique lines of the forward set cab and the exposed fenders. Everything only gets more complicated during the extraction of such a heavy relic. The most significant find was the original manual starting crank, which remained mounted firmly on its factory bracket. Such a component is considered an extreme rarity even within the collections of the most prestigious military museums. These small physical details serve as a silent record of the machine's long service life. The M3 half-track serves as the next evolution in this lineage of specialized transport. It represents a hybrid design that sits exactly between a standard truck and a full tank. This machine broke every established convention of its era through its unique layout. The transition to the next level of mechanical history begins with the study of this armored carrier. Thus ends the account of the Scammell Pioneer, a vehicle that carried the weight of history through the most difficult terrain of the 20th century. 147 horsepower was the output generated by the massive white 16X inline 6-cylinder engine. This power plant, boasting 6.3 liters of displacement, served as the mechanical heart of the M3 half-track. Introduced by the United States in 1941, this vehicle became one of the most versatile and iconic components of the American war effort. Why was a hybrid drive system chosen for such a critical transport role? At first glance, the combination of front wheels and rear tracks seems like a compromise. But in reality, this configuration allowed the vehicle to merge the precise maneuverability of a truck with the high traction required to traverse nearly any broken terrain. The process of moving 13 armed soldiers plus their gear is only gaining momentum once the 4-speed manual transmission is engaged. This system included low-range gearing specifically designed to power the rear tracks during heavy transport or moderate pulling tasks. One can notice how the front suspension uses semi-elliptical leaf springs to manage steering, while the rear track assembly rides on specialized bogie wheels. These wheels rotate ceaselessly to absorb the heavy impacts of uneven ground, protecting the steel body and the crew inside. It gets more complex further on. Steel plating offered partial protection for the occupants, turning the hull into a mobile fortress. In certain configurations, the vehicle was fitted with Browning 50 caliber machine guns for direct fire support. Such tactical flexibility ensured its deployment across the Pacific, North Africa, and Western Europe by both American and Allied forces. The equipment gradually proved its worth in the harshest climates imaginable. Everything only gets more complicated when considering the long-term survival of these machines after the conflict ended. One fascinating account involves a surviving M3 discovered at an abandoned airfield in Tunisia decades after the war. This site had functioned as a temporary supply base during the North African campaign. It is visible how the half-track remained half-buried near the ruins of a makeshift hangar, with sections of its rusted track still protruding from the sand. For many years, the interior cab of the vehicle had been repurposed as a shelter by local shepherds. Faded on the side was the hand-painted inscription Baston Express, a detail suggesting the vehicle might have been slated for reassignment to the European front. Technical hybrids like the M3 carry battlefield memories that extend far beyond their original mechanical functions. The transition to the next level of design eccentricity is immediate. Beyond the American motor pools, other nations experimented with even more unusual layouts. There exists a German truck with a design so unconventional that it appeared to be built entirely backward. This machine represents the next stage of specialized military engineering. 55 horsepower was the total output delivered by the Krupp M304 engine, a 4-cylinder horizontally opposed boxer configuration with 3.3 liters of displacement. Why was such a modest power plant chosen for a primary military transport? While the output seems low by modern standards, the engine was exceptionally lightweight and reliable, providing sufficient torque to haul infantry supplies and light artillery across varying terrains. This mechanical heart powered the Krupp Proz L2H143, a light 6-wheeled truck developed in the late 1930s by Krupp in Germany. The Proz was used extensively by the Wehrmacht during the early stages of World War II. It featured a front-mounted engine, a recessed driver's cab, and a lowered chassis that created an unconventional silhouette for a military vehicle. At first glance, the layout looks visually jarring, but in reality, the low-profile angular design served a technical purpose by aiding in camouflage and reducing visibility to enemy aircraft. It gets more complex further on. One can notice how the rear of the vehicle was equipped with side-facing bench seats and an open cab to facilitate rapid troop deployment. The transmission consisted of a 4-speed manual gearbox driving the rear wheels, while the suspension utilized leaf springs specifically tuned to navigate rough dirt roads with stability. Transition to the next level. The truck became a specialized workhorse during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns, primarily tasked with ammunition delivery and towing light weapons like the 36mm Pack anti-tank gun. It is visible how the agile frame allowed for quick maneuvering during the invasions of Poland, France, and the initial push into the Soviet Union. The process of its dominance in the field was only gaining momentum until the mid-war period. Because the demands of the front lines changed, the Proz was gradually gradually phased out as heavier and more powerful trucks became a necessity for logistics. Everything only gets more complicated as these machines transition from the battlefield to civilian life. One can notice a particularly fascinating example discovered in a partially collapsed stone barn in a small village near the border of Germany and the Czech Republic. Following the conclusion of the war, the vehicle had been converted into a makeshift farm workshop. It stood surrounded by piles of scrap metal, discarded tires, and rusted hand tools. The chassis remained entirely intact despite decades of neglect. The boxer engine had been partially disassembled, and a rough plank of wood had been laid across the engine bay to serve as a workbench. It only looks obvious as a piece of junk, but in reality, it is a preserved fragment of engineering history. A military vehicle from the early Blitzkrieg era was repurposed into a stationary farm tool bench. The material remains in this state, marking the end of its mobile service. 140 horsepower is the output generated by the 6-cylinder inline Maybach HL62 TUK engine powering this heavy machine. Why did the German military invest so much engineering into a 7-liter displacement engine for a transport vehicle? At first glance, it seems like an excessive amount of power for a simple troop carrier, but this mechanical heart was necessary to move the massive weight of the SDKFC-7 Sonderkraftfahrzeug. This versatile platform, designed by Krauss Maffei in the 1930s, functioned as a mobile artillery base and a reliable troop transport simultaneously. The vehicle measures approximately 22 feet in length and features a sturdy metal body with longitudinal seating for 12 fully equipped soldiers. One can notice how the prominent rear tracks dominate the profile of the machine, providing the necessary grip for hauling heavy guns such as the 88mm flak. This weapon served as Germany's primary anti-aircraft and anti-tank piece, weighing several tons. The process is only gaining momentum as various configurations of the half-track allowed it to transform into a self-propelled gun platform by mounting the artillery piece directly onto the chassis. Engineers designed the transmission with a 5-speed manual gearbox that included a dedicated low-range option for navigating exceptionally rough terrain. The equipment gradually powers both the front wheels and the rear track assembly through a twin drive shaft setup, maintaining reliable handling on asphalt while delivering high performance on unpaved ground. Front suspension relies on heavy leaf springs, while the track system runs on independent bogies equipped with coil springs. It is visible how this combination allows for relatively smooth movement even when the vehicle is under a maximum load of equipment and troops. Over 12,000 units of the SDKFC-7 were produced by 1945, seeing service on every major theater from the North African desert to the frozen Eastern Front. It seems simple to categorize this as a strictly military tool, but in reality, its utility extended far beyond the battlefield into the post-war era. One can notice the remnants of these machines appearing in unexpected locations, such as a rural farm in Hungary where a modified unit was discovered serving as a logging tractor. The original towing assembly and the rear tracks remained intact on the Hungarian farm despite the heavy modifications for forestry work. Beneath layers of faded red paint applied by an unknowing farmer, the German military insignia was still clearly visible to observers. A machine that once stood as a centerpiece of a modernized artillery force ended its functional life as a humble piece of agricultural equipment. Everything only gets more complicated as the focus shifts towards specialized hybrid machines. These next vehicles were engineered specifically to survive the catastrophic mud and ice conditions found on the Eastern Front. From this point, the narrative moves toward the development of systems designed for extreme environmental endurance. 75 horsepower was the approximate output generated by the 3.6-liter inline 6-cylinder engine of the Opel Maltier. On the frozen and saturated muddy roads of the Eastern Front, conventional wheeled trucks frequently became immobilized. Why did the German military command decide to develop such a specialized hybrid vehicle? Standard logistics reached a total standstill under extreme weather conditions. By combining a truck chassis with a tracked rear suspension, they created a machine capable of navigating terrain that rendered all other transport methods useless. One can notice how the Maltier retained its original front axle and steering wheels for directional control. But this is just the beginning. The rear axle was entirely removed and replaced with a tracked system heavily inspired by components from captured British Matilda tanks. This configuration utilized bogies equipped with coil springs for the rear tracks, while the front end maintained its semi-elliptical leaf springs for basic shock absorption. The process is only gaining momentum. A 4-speed manual gearbox worked in tandem with a low-range transfer case to ensure the vehicle could crawl through deep snow. It seems like a simple modification, but in reality, the Maltier was a masterpiece of wartime improvisation. The chassis was based on the Opel Blitz 3.636S model, which provided a reliable foundation for the conversion. Because the design prioritized simplicity, the factory could assemble these units rapidly using basic steel or wooden cargo beds. Some variants featured a hardtop cabin while others utilized a soft cover. Transition to the next level. The lightweight body allowed the 75 horsepower engine to focus all its torque on moving the heavy tracks through thick mire. Everything only gets more complicated when analyzing the logistics of the Soviet Union theater. These vehicles operated primarily in rear line positions where the infrastructure had completely collapsed. Reliability and adaptability were the primary traits that made this machine essential for field crews. One can notice how the unusual silhouette of the half-track became a common sight across the vast eastern territories. It was not built for speed, but for the relentless task of moving supplies when the earth turned into liquid mud. One specific and notable example was discovered inside an abandoned warehouse in Ukraine after decades of neglect. It lay buried beneath heavy tarps and wooden crates, serving as an accidental structural support for a small farm tool shed. The camera glides along the frame where the tracks had long since disappeared, yet the rear bogie setup remained largely intact. Experts eventually confirmed that this specific unit was an early production model. It actually utilized mechanical parts salvaged directly from British Matilda tanks captured during the North African campaign. It only looks obvious now, but the Maltier represented a desperate yet brilliant response to a strategic crisis. Most of these machines were either destroyed in combat or scrapped for their metal immediately following the conclusion of the war. This makes the surviving few incredibly rare artifacts of mechanical history. The vehicle was neither aesthetically pleasing nor exceptionally powerful in terms of raw speed. It fulfilled its singular purpose of maintaining the flow of supplies through the most hostile environments on the planet. The molten stream of wartime production eventually ceased, but the legacy of the Maltier remains as a testament to engineering under pressure. This concludes the examination of the half-track logistics system. The journey through the most improbable and strange transport vehicles of the era now reaches its final and most significant entry. Thus ends one of the key chapters of heavy transport history. 1942 was the year the GMC DUKW 6x6 was developed in the United States, marking it not merely as a truck, but as a bold leap in military engineering. Why was this specific design considered so essential during the global conflict? It was engineered to operate with equal efficiency on both solid land and open water, filling a critical gap in logistics. The vehicle became one of the most unusual yet indispensable assets of World War II. The strange designation of DUKW originated from an internal GMC coding system. Within this nomenclature, the letter D signifies the model year of 1942. The letter U represents the utility purpose of the chassis, while K indicates the all-wheel drive capability. Finally, the letter W identifies the dual rear axles that provided the necessary traction. A GMC 270 inline 6-cylinder engine provided the mechanical power for the craft. This power plant featured a displacement of 4.4 liters and produced approximately 91 horsepower. The camera glides along the drivetrain where a 5-speed manual transmission connects to a low-range gearbox. This assembly is linked to a transfer case that distributes torque to both the wheels and a rear-mounted propeller. On land, the machine utilized a full 6x6 drive system to navigate difficult terrain. In aquatic environments, it could reach a speed of approximately 5 miles per hour, which is equivalent to 8 kilometers per hour. A combination of leaf spring suspension and a naval-grade steel hull ensured the structure was both rugged and buoyant. One can notice how the metallic hull is shaped to displace water while supporting the weight of the mechanical components. The Duck W featured integrated bilge pumps and an advanced onboard tire pressure regulation system. This allowed drivers to adjust the inflation levels to suit varied terrain or soft coastal sand, representing a cutting-edge technological feature for that era. At first glance, the vehicle appeared to be a boat mounted on wheels. It was characterized by a sloped bow, a short windshield, high sides, and a complete absence of traditional fenders. Everything only gets more complicated when considering its operational requirements. Amphibious transport of troops and supplies directly from ships to the shoreline was the primary mission of this machine. This capability eliminated the requirement for established docks or complex landing infrastructure during an invasion. The vehicle played a major role in the D-Day landings in Normandy, as well as significant operations across the Pacific and Italy. It gets more complex further on, as the DUKW transitioned to civilian roles in post-war recovery missions and various humanitarian aid efforts. Decades after the conclusion of the war, one of these remarkable vehicles was discovered half submerged at the edge of a lake on a rural property in Poland. It was found partially covered in layers of algae and thick aquatic vegetation. It is visible how the water has reclaimed portions of the steel hull over the passage of time. Locals in the area claimed the machine had been abandoned there since the 1940s. During the 1960s, the rusting hulk was occasionally utilized as a stationary fishing platform. The most bizarre technical detail of the find was the fact that the propeller remained firmly attached to its shaft. According to various eyewitness accounts, the blades would still spin slowly with the natural movement of the water current. It appeared as if the vehicle had never truly ceased its mechanical existence. The DUKW stands as a perfect embodiment of wartime innovation through its simple and rugged construction. It proved brilliantly effective in the specific environments where its dual-purpose nature mattered most. Throughout this journey, more than just forgotten vehicles have been uncovered. The investigation has revisited machines that served as the backbone of historical transitions. The material is ready to move to the next processing phase without haste. 100% of these heavy machines represent more than just the abandoned remnants of a bygone era. Why were such unconventional and often bizarre designs ever allowed to reach the assembly line? At first glance, the mechanical silhouettes seem impractical, but a single sentence of delay reveals the answer. These vehicles were the physical response to extreme logistical nightmares where any standard transport would simply fail. Engineering solutions emerged from the desperate pressure of global conflict, where a mechanical breakdown could cost human lives rather than just a simple delay. One can notice how the structural frames were reinforced to withstand terrain that would swallow common civilian trucks. But this is just the beginning. Some units originated in massive, high-output factories, while others were assembled using salvaged parts directly in the field. It is visible how the metal plates were welded with haste, creating a patchwork of functional resilience. These machines were never intended to endure for decades, yet their steel skeletons remain as witnesses to a world undergoing a violent transformation. Everything only gets more complicated when considering that these designs were born from necessity rather than aesthetic choice. The legacy of these trucks captivates those who analyze the specific value of functional engineering developed under extreme environmental stress. It only looks obvious that they were simple tools, but in reality, they were the primary lifeline for entire divisions. The equipment gradually transitions from active service to historical artifacts, preserving the technical history of survival and adaptation. The story of these mechanical answers concludes this phase, opening the road to a deeper understanding of military history. This marks the end of the technical overview regarding these specific industrial survivors. Thus ends one of the key stages of the narrative concerning heavy transport evolution. The material is ready to move to the next processing phase without haste.